So, I mean, you grew up in Melbourne, didn't you?
Yeah, I was born in Melbourne, and I grew up predominantly there.
Ah. What was the music scene like there when you were growing up?
When I was growing up, I mean, I was obsessed with music from an early age. And first by hearing music on the radio, and then becoming an obsessive record collector, I think a lot of people that grow up in smaller countries have a feeling that they're living in a place which is culturally inferior, and I really looked mainly to the UK and the USA for that was where I thought a lot of the music I heard was from, because I had what's affectionately known as the cultural cringe in Australian music, and so until punk rock came along, and then there were bands like the Boys Next Door, who were exciting and also Australian,
Yeah.
Most of the first band I ever saw was the Monkees, and that was when I was pretty little, and I had my parents take me to that show, a lot of my musical revelations happened in the early 70s, and then I had learned instruments in school. I kind of had a problem sight reading, and then when punk rock came along, that kind of democratized the whole process of playing instruments. You didn't have to be a virtuoso, and I taught myself bass guitar, and then I moved to London, and then I bought my first synthesizer, which was a Wasp synthesizer, and then soon after that got a Korg MS-20, and then I started making tapes, and went on from there.
And so the punk scene, was that in London? You lived in London, didn't you?
I moved to London in '78.
Yeah.
And so that was like I say, I liberated. I think a lot of people who formed bands in '76 and '77, they were informed by stuff like David Bowie and Roxy Music and Alice Cooper and things like that. You could say children of glam, and I was one of those. That was, stuff like that, and the sensational Alex Harvey band, and and also prog rock I really liked when I was a kid, and those were, things that kind of informed me. But I always like to say that if punk rock was kind of the Big Bang, then the aftershocks of the Big Bang were what happened when those people who were liberated by picking up an instrument for the first time then discovered new ways of playing those instruments in ways that were kind of suited to them, or using them as sound generating devices, or the sort of fracturing of music, because punk rock was still kind of 3-chord rock and roll or whatever, but it soon turned into something very different. And by the time that I arrived in London, one of the first bands I saw was Throb and Gristle, and and then there were bands like This Heat and Joy Division and Essential Logic, and the pop group playing constantly, and so it was the birth and label distribution and stuff. And there's an echo going on here. Hello?
Yeah, I'm still here. It's okay. So,
Okay. And so, Rough Trade was starting distribution. They were starting a label, and labels like Mute were putting out their first records, and that means of distribution thing was also important to me.
Was it more about the level of control that you could have over your own music?
Well, no, because it wasn't exactly, it wasn't like it wasn't like there was anyone trying to control the music,
Yeah.
It was just that the means of distribution were democratized and they were in your hands, and because there was a mystery to music. There was a mystery to playing like John McLaughlin or something like that, or to going into a recording studio and putting out a record. The independent label network demystified that, and there were bands like Desperate Bicycles and Scritti Politti who openly showed you on their records, like Scritti Politti's first record had a cost breakdown on the sleeve of how much it cost them to make the record and how they pressed it and distributed it. And Desperate Bicycles, I think, did the same thing,
Brilliant.
And Mark P had this fanzine called Sniffing Glue, and just like go out and form a band, and it was the whole it was fractured, and another there were several events and elements that went towards some of the conclusions that led me to putting out the first Foetus record and distributing it myself, which were also being in London, working at a record store, and starting to learn about the means of distribution. But also around that time I met Steve Stapleton, who had a band Nurse with Wound, or Project Nurse with Wound. And I'd met him. He worked down the street, and he came into the store one day, and he had and we had the first Nurse with Wound record in stock, and he came up to me and said, "Have you heard this record? What's it like?" And then I described what it was like, because I had listened to it, and I think he was impressed that I'd listened to it, and we started talking, and he said, "Well, I am that guy," and we started talking, and Steve had a kind of every Friday night he would go to this 8-track studio in Shepherd's Bush called IPS, and he would go in with not necessarily any ideas, but he may go in with a couple of objects or things that make sounds, or he would some things that he wanted to make tape loops from, and he wasn't necessarily using instruments. He might be using a chair or a ratchet or something like that, and just making a sound and recording it, and then manipulating it and turning it backwards and slowing it down. And by the time he was through with his process, the source material was unrecognizable, and that was like such a liberating approach to things, along with the excitement that was happening everywhere else. And around the same time, I was discovering and delving deeper into 20th century classical music, and I think that Steve Reich's early tape experiments were really revelatory to me. It's Gonna Rain and Come Out, and those sort of things led me to the very divergent ways that people reached musical conclusions and created compositions, like like John Cage and Stockhausen, and reading up about people like that. So all of these elements were kind of colliding in my head, along with noise and the huge consumption of music that I'd made in the previous 10 years, and all of those things tend to infuse my DNA, and then they start to come out in strange combinations, so there may be elements of musique concrète colliding with funk and show tunes, or whoever.
One thing I liked. I'm sorry to interrupt.
The other thing is that it was I had been in a band briefly, and Spec Records, which had started from the ashes of Pragbek, and working in that way made me decide I didn't want to work in a democratic environment. So I decided to make my first record where I played all the instruments, even though I'm not a great instrumentalist, but I wanted something where I could stand or fall on my own individual statements. And that continued with Foetus for many years, where I played all the instruments. And as such, the studio became a large part of the technology of the studio became a large part of the compositional process and the sound and an instrument for me.
Did you find that, because there's a few groups like Throbbing Gristle that were sort of making these electronic soundscapes as well, and do you find that as a good sort of, it sort of creates a mood on which you can add things to it? I always found that a really great thing about industrial music. It sort of was creating sort of a soundscape of emotion that you could sort of build on. Did you?
No, not really. Well, first of all, I don't identify personally with, the term industrial music, and I feel like that's kind of been thrust on me, and I don't. I mean, for me, industrial music was Throbbing Gristle, and then Einstürzende Neubauten. I mean, Throbbing Gristle kind of started the term. And then I would say, in its purest form, Einstürzende Neubauten, and then, maybe Test Department and things like that. But then it just sort of turned into dance music.
Yeah.
And I've always distanced myself from the term industrial music, and I feel like what I've done is so diverse and so. I straddle so many fields that I don't like to be hindered by any, by being hindered by any labels.
Oh no, sorry, I wasn't trying to imply that you were. It's what I meant was, because a lot of your music I thought was, it was quite sort of almost like a film soundtrack. In terms of you were sort of building a story up with different effects and different emotions.
Yeah. Well, I'm heavily influenced by soundtracks and by and have been for eternity. And I think probably my first ever musical musical input was soundtracks, and my first musical memories are the soundtracks of Warner Brothers cartoons.
Oh, really?
But I never really built my music around soundscapes per se. I never, because I usually come to things with a kind of a complete composition in my head, and I don't really improvise. I don't sort of play, mess around on things and let things evolve. I'm usually coming to conclusions. But when you're someone who's playing all the instruments yourself, obviously you're putting down one overdub at a time, and that changes. You can it's sometimes you have to steer it from the original conception that you have in your head to other avenues that are opened up as you hear the realization of those individual parts coming to life, and sometimes they steer you in a different direction, you know. So sometimes you have to let them go in that direction, and other times you have to steer back to your original concept.
How long does it generally take you to sort of finalise in your head a composition before you start work at in the studio?
Oh, sometimes it's instantaneous. You know, the whole thing comes to me. And other times I'll be walking around with an idea for years.
So when did you first meet Matt Johnson?
We first met, I think it was 1980. And when the first Foetus single came out, I got involved with Cherry Red, who had a publishing arm called Complete, and they published that in some of my early records. And it was at the Cherry Red Christmas party, and Theo Chalmers, who was the publishing guy, said, "You've got to meet this guy, Matt Johnson." And Matt, I knew who he was. I'd seen the play a few times, and we'd been in the same room many times and seen each other around, but we didn't actually know each other. And when we met, we hit it off really well, and you know, we've been friends ever since.
And how did you get involved with the actual music making? Because I mean, I think obviously I don't know Matt and I don't know yourself, but you seem to have the same sort of working, the ways of working. You know, where you both are sort of very meticulous. You've got a great sort of work ethic going on. Did you find that about Matt?
I don't think we have the same ways of working, actually. You know, I think we're pretty different. I think he writes, first of all, he writes on instruments. I don't really write on instruments. I write in my head, and then I figure out how to play the stuff. We both go down different paths all the time. You know, I mean, Matt has, you know, he started with the Burning Blue Soul album, but before, you know, Burning Blue Soul, I seem to, I remember the shows that I saw before they'd made any records, as being, and this might be, you know, a blurry memory, but they see the climax of the shows were really cacophonous, and they turned into, like, you know, really noisy and playing around with effects a lot, and but you know, there were songs in there, but it was aggressive, and then when Burning Blue Soul came out, that was very psychedelic, I thought, you know, and psychedelic, but a kind of a dark psychedelia, and that, you know, with a lot of studio experimentation, and maybe that's, you know, where Matt and I are similar, that we are kind of, you know, the captains of our projects, you know, and he's, you know, that was very much him in the studio by himself creating that record, and then the went on and, you know, took its different forms, and, you know, he worked with tons of different musicians and had different lineups in his band and so on. And he had great mainstream success, which I didn't really seek, you know. I think that, you know, it was just fairly obvious by some of the perversity of the project titles that I chose.
But one thing I noticed about both of you as well is that you both were sort of like shy of publicity. You know, you didn't use your faces on album covers, that sort of thing. Was it a general shyness, or just, you know, you didn't really just seek fame? You just wanted to make music?
No, mine was more. Mine was drawn. My idea of not using my face on record covers was drawn from several things. One was creating a mystique around the project, and I didn't really want it to be a kind of cult of personality thing. On the early records, I published press releases saying that Foetus, the first one was Foetus Under Glass, was a trio of two Brazilian statistics collectors and their pen pal from Athens, Georgia. Mm-hmm. And I found, and I don't think I had names for the members, but so it gave it a mystique, and it put, it made it a sort of a third person kind of thing. So I could go to, because in those days I would just go up to the BBC, in my lunch hour, or I'd go to NME or something like that, and you drop off a copy of your single and say, "Here, I've got a new single," and
yeah,
and you put it with a press release, and it gave you it meant that I could be the corporate representative of this project, and the musicians were someone else. That was a little bit informed by the Residents too, who I was a big fan of. Keeping this anonymity, and I kept that going for quite a while, and I found that you could write a press release and send it to the music press, and they would print it verbatim. So the next one, was "You've Got Foetus in Your Breath," and I said that they were a 7-piece, and I listed everyone's names, and one of the names was Clint Ruin, and then Clint Ruin emerged later in various projects, and so there was that, and also there's some conceptual through lines in Foetus with the color palette that I chose on the sleeves, which is generally red, white, and black with shades of gray, and all of the album titles are 4-letter, 1-syllable words. And of course, for many years until the album Gash in 1995, I played all the instruments on every record, and generally I still play all the instruments on Foetus. But now and then I'll have a guest on there, and recently I've had guest vocalists on Foetus projects too. It was a way of staying away from that cultural cult of personality thing, but then I kind of got a little, it was too hard to keep up, and I got a little sick of that, and so then I kind of came out of the closet,
Yeah. I noticed that a lot of you from the same sort of era, the same sort of bands, when I say that I mean sort of basically yourself and Matt Johnson. I'm sorry to go on about Matt Johnson a lot, but a lot of you moved to New York around about the same time. What was happening in New York that, was it just a general case of things weren't really happening in London, or was it just a better scene in New York?
It was, the reason I moved to New York was because I did a show here with Lydia Lunch, Mark Almond, and Nick Cave under the name The Immaculate Consumptive, and that was Halloween '83, and I just fell in love with New York, and I just stayed. And the thing is that I'd been in London for 5 years, and when I moved to New York, it was the exact opposite of London. Everything was centralized. At the time, New York was a very East Village centric cultural scene. I'm sure that there was a lot of people that probably didn't go north of 14th Street or south of Houston, and it was a 24-hour city. So and you could walk everywhere at that point, whereas London was so dispersed, so hard, you would have to, at one point I was like living in Hackney and working in Acton, so I literally every day I had to like go across London, and it was the same if you went to go see a concert, you might be living in Brixton and go to see a concert in West Hampstead or something, and then the tubes would close down at midnight, and so hard to get around, and and a very different feeling. It was still, in London, it was kind of like you felt like you were being told what to do by the school principal, whereas it was very much a different vibe in New York, and I really liked it, and stayed on. And it was, there was definitely, I was aware of what was happening, some of the things that were happening here musically. I mean, I knew about Sonic Youth, I knew about Glenn Branca, and there was, I met a lot of people as soon as I got here, and I decided to stay. I didn't stay because of what was going on musically, but I was also in a relationship with Lydia Lunch, and we decided we wanted to move here, and that was kind of how it came about. But musically, what by that time I was signed with Some Bizarre, and I was continuing to make records for them, and I had already had a good relationship with a couple of engineers in London, and I was in the middle of a couple of projects, so I was actually kind of going back and forth and recording in London at that time. But I stayed on and here since then. So I've actually lived here for most of my life.
Oh wow! Has it been that long? Wow, I didn't realise. I suppose it must be.
For 35 years.
Well, you've got quite a diverse. Because you're right. I mean, you are sort of linked with industrial music, but your output is so incredibly diverse, isn't it? I mean, it's been sort of big band and orchestras and pretty much everything. I mean, I don't think you've not done any sort of musical style. Is that more?
I haven't done yet.
Say again, sorry.
There's a couple of things that I haven't done yet. I mean, I haven't worked with. I've worked with large ensembles. But I haven't worked with a symphony orchestra. I mean, I've created pieces that sound like they're by a symphony orchestra, but I've yet to make a record with a symphony orchestra, and that's something that I'm hoping I do on the next Foetus album. And I'm also interested in doing some choral work, and I haven't worked with choirs. So there's still a lot of things that I want to do. I've started working on an opera, and that's going to still take quite a long time to do. But the thing is that I have to try and budget my time, and time management is really crucial for me, because I have to look at my ambitions and see if there's enough time to cram them all into my life.
Yeah, I've heard that you get up really, really early and stay up really, really late just to try and get everything done in one day. Is that how you work generally? Yeah,
and also because there's I go out and see music a lot, and part of my time management is that you have to accommodate a certain amount of procrastination as well.
I always wondered as well, because I know you're not sort of classically musically trained. So how do you go about putting your ideas through to the large ensembles? Because I mean, obviously they read music, don't they? How do you go about that?
I'm self-taught with that, but usually I work in Logic, and so I create templates. If say I'm writing for a string quartet, I'll set up a template which will be different voicings of the instruments. So I'll have violin 1, violin 2, cello, viola, and cello, and I'll have all of those instruments in arco, all of those instruments spiccato, all of those instruments pizzicato, all of those instruments tremolo, and so on. And then I'll come to write sort of cells where I might have a section where the viola is playing spiccato, and then the two violins might be playing a melody harmony in arco, and then the cello might be playing pizz. So I'll work on sections like that, jumping around in the template, and then when the composition's finished, I then have to merge all of those performances to make one. I go into the scoring page and I have all of those merged, and then I have to write the expression into that.
Yeah.
So I write here, bar 76 cello kits, blah blah blah. So then I can end up with a readable score. But it's not a very Logic doesn't generate very elegant scores. So then I'll work with maybe someone with one of my colleagues and import it into Sibelius or a scoring program like that, and have them. And there you can make the expression more elegant and put in page turns and things like that. And so that I've just kind of learned by working with musicians and teaching myself the best methodology of doing that. And then, so say if I'm writing for, trumpet or French horn or clarinet or whatever, I'll just, transpose it for that, or a lot of instrumentalists will just read in concert pitch, and maybe sometimes I'll just keep it in concert pitch and generate scores like that, and then sometimes collaborating with people on these things.
So, I mean, I know you've got ambition to go for like a full-on orchestra and choirs, and is there a famous composer that you really like, that you're sort of influenced by? Do you have a sound in your head of?
Tons of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm often listening to. I listen to a lot of music all the time, and particularly if I listen to contemporary classical music, I'll listen to the voicings on things, and I'll try and figure out how they're done, or that's a mystery to me, and that could be, people like Penderecki and Ligeti, the way that they use tonal clusters and you get those sort of sounds from an orchestra. That's always been, stunning to me, and so I'm always curious about how that's done, and because I generate scores, but I don't. I personally don't sight read. I can look at a score and follow it, but it's still difficult for me to figure out how. I can dissect it, but sometimes I have to describe things and then figure out how they're expressed. Like if I write, say, a string quartet, and it's I've written a couple of pieces for Kronos Quartet. Usually when I write those pieces, I'll workshop them with a different quartet, and I'll run the piece and see if what I'm doing in MIDI translates to real instruments, and I'll work with them, and they'll say, well, I think that we should, bars 92 to 94, let's put can you play that viola part up an octave, or, here I want to play, close to the bridge, or, here, I want it to be, you've got to really dig in here, and it's got to be, dissonant scrapes here and things like that. And so you edge closer to it and then put that into the score. And I've increasingly in the last few years, I've been trying to work with more instructional scores and different ways of generating music. I did a commission, I think it was last year maybe, for Great Learning Orchestra, which was it's an ensemble in Stockholm, which is based on the Cornelius Cardew model of scratch orchestra, where people have varying abilities on their instruments. Some people can play very well and read music, and other people can read, but they're slow readers, and other people don't read at all, and some people just want to make a sound, and so you've got this great spectrum of musicians with varying abilities and coming from varying backgrounds to kind of accommodate into one piece. And so within this 40-minute piece, I went through kind of instructional sections and voice pieces and guided improvisation and then traditional score as well. And that's just scratching the surface.
You seem to be on a quest just to understand everything about the mechanics of music, don't you? You seem to be constantly sort of curious about all aspects of music, which is really good.
Well, I came to everything ass backwards, and it's taken me 20 years to discover something that I probably would have discovered in the first 6 months if I'd been in a conservatory. But I have to. I reach it by way of my own conclusions, and because I'm writing for instruments that I don't necessarily play or understand the fingering of. I don't, if often people will write for instruments and it will be they're thinking in terms of the ease of fingering and things like that, which I don't necessarily do. So I write a lot of the stuff that I write is very difficult to play because it's kind of all over the place, and there'll be like huge, just big jumps, that are not necessarily, comfortable to play, and sometimes I have to work with the musician to accommodate that, and it's like, playing them up, different strings and things like that, or, like sometimes dropping an octave and things like that.
So tell us about the, I'll try to pronounce it, is it Xordox?
Yeah, Zorox.
Aha. So how did all that come about?
Well, the genesis of Zorox was, I was invited by John Zorn to play a concert in honor of William Burroughs' centenary, and I didn't have anything. And first I said, no, I don't have anything to do. And but at the time, I borrowed a Moog little fatty from a friend, and I had just MIDI'd it up with a microKORG and put it into my computer, and I'd been messing around with just sort of arpeggiating things and enjoying that, so I thought, well, I wonder if I could make something out of this, because of the stone where this thing was going to be. It was like, it holds 75 people. It's not a lot of scrutiny, and I'd been wanting to do something with Sarah Lipstate for a while, who has a project called Noveller, and so I emailed Sarah and said, are you going to be in town on this date? And she said, well, I'm getting back the day before. And I said, well, would you want to do this project with me? And so I came up with half a dozen kind of frameworks and gave her some notes to play, and we rehearsed once and did it. And I was really happy with how it turned out. So I started developing that a little bit, and we did some other shows. And then Sarah moved to LA, and I started writing stuff that I didn't really. She plays very processed guitar, which it sounds very un-guitar-like. But I was starting to write stuff that I didn't really didn't accommodate that, and she'd moved to LA, and so I kind of took over the project and called it Xordox, and then turned it into an album, and which was released on Editions Mego, and then I kind of reinvented the live version of that as a so played live. It's two people, and recently it's been myself and Simon Haynes. and we both play synthesizers live, and I do a bit of, I also play theremin and do vocals on one piece, and which are heavily treated, and it's thematically, it's very, conceptually, it's very outer space oriented, and it's a kind of a love letter to a lot of that classic electronic music that I like from, the 70s, and that it's my, filtered through my sensibility, which, takes on a lot of my personality. And that's how it's, I'm working on a second album of that material for that project.
I've seen a bit of it on the internet. It looks really interesting. Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's definitely got a look. We have a visual backdrop which was created by Sten Backman, who is a Swedish artist I met over there in the course of spending a lot of time in Stockholm doing a residency at EMS and doing this piece for the Great Learning Orchestra, who I mentioned, and I met him through the Great Learning Orchestra.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this, Jim. It's been brilliant.